Even though all these scenes appear to be underwater, they're far from it. They're all filmed without a hint of water in a dry studio using a filming technique called dry for wet. The concept behind the technique is quite simple. Instead of having to deal with underwater scenes that would increase the complexity of the shot, the underwater look is simulated through lighting, fans, lots and lots of smoke, and in some cases, high frame rates. It's quite amazing how these simple ingredients can sell the illusion of being underwater. The technique is still being used to this day because of how effective it is. Not to mention how much easier it is to shoot compared to filming in water.
We've all heard stories of how difficult it is to shoot water-related movies. They tell you not to work with kids and animals, but they really tell you don't work in water if you can help it.
Underwater filming is not only incredibly difficult to shoot, but it's also incredibly demanding to cast and crew. James Cameron knows firsthand how incredibly taxing that is. He's one of the few directors who managed to extensively shoot underwater not once, but twice. His 1989 movie The Abyss had a ton of underwater shots. To achieve that though, it required a budget reserved only for blockbusters, an abandoned nuclear plant, and months of grueling training and planning. Even with all safety precautions, shooting underwater is still a dangerous affair. In one case, it almost cost Eddie Harris's life.
I did this sign, out of air, unhook myself, get over to the wall. I got no air, I'm waiting for air, and this guy's hung up somewhere. I got nobody to give me air. And I was hanging there, out of breath, no air, and I'm going, oh, this is great, you know. And then one of the guys swims over, another guy, and he gives me his regulator. I'm just about to burst, to take in a lungful of water, and he gives me his regulator, and he gives it to me upside down. So I get like half air and half water. Went like that. I got a lot of water in my lungs, and, you know, and I said, well, this is something wrong here, you know, and then I kind of thought, maybe I didn't purge the regulator, blew out what air I'd gotten in, took another big breath, got water back in my lungs, and for a split second, I really thought I was a goner, and then Al came swimming over, the cameraman, ripped the thing out of wherever the guy was and put his regulator in the right way, took a big breath, and I went, man, okay, let's go up for a second.
Even Cameron, though, with all his dedication and love for underwater shooting, knew that some sequences just had to be shot as dry for wet. Otherwise, they would be impossible to do in real life. To achieve these shots, the studio was filled with smoke, effectively recreating a water environment. The model subs would be on a motion control rig, making things much easier to repeat, and as a result, getting the final shot. To help sell the effect, pre-recorded footage of the actors were projected on the inside of the miniature subs. A year later, in 1990, the movie The Hunt for Red October would also heavily rely on the dry for wet technique. The movie had a big amount of underwater submarine shots. These scenes would just be impossible to do in real life. The script had chase sequences between submarines, near-miss collisions with rocks and torpedoes, and elaborate establishing shots of the submarine. Even if something like this would be possible and within a normal budget, it would still be an incredibly time-consuming process. This is where dry for wet comes in. ILM, the studio behind the effects, used a dry stage which gave the crew a ton of control over the shot. The elements used in order to simulate the effect were simple but very effective. First and foremost, smoke, the key ingredient in simulating water. The strong lights around the stage gave volume to the water, and finally the rocks made out of tinfoil were carefully placed around the stage, completing the underwater environment. These tinfoil rocks were light enough to be moved around and repositioned according to the requirements of the shot. The submarine model was suspended on a metal frame by wires. This rig gave the model the ability to pitch and yaw in a very smooth fashion, similar to how it would move in the sea. And because the whole rig was motion controlled, the crew had the ability to redo the scene over and over until they had the result they needed. The dry for wet technique allowed them to create some elaborate camera moves. There's one in particular that comes to mind. In this sequence, the camera moves extremely close to the submarine, effectively showcasing the sheer size of it. To achieve that, they created a rig where the camera was shooting the model through a set of mirrors. One of the mirrors was placed very close to the model, and the camera was effectively recording the action through that mirror. This gave the impression that the camera was moving extremely close to the sub. The motion control rig had one extra function. It gave the CG artist the camera and submarine movement data that would feed into ILM's particle system. The particle effects would help sell the underwater look. They simulated floating plankton, submarine wakes, and torpedo trails. This was ILM's very first general-purpose particle system. All water shots done at ILM went through that system, and Scott E. Anderson, the person who wrote the particle system, was also responsible for every shot requiring particles. Most recently, Guillermo del Toro used it to great effect on his 2017 movie Shape of Water. One of the very first sequences of the movie is shot dry for wet. In that shot, we see the protagonist of the film floating in a room flooded with water. The stage was filled with smoke while overhead projectors run a high contrast pattern emulating caustics. Some props were also hung on monofilaments to make them appear as floating. The actor was also suspended on wires, and the whole effect was finalized in post with several elements like floating props, bubbles, and fish. Dry for wet sequences are often shot with fans and in high speed, especially when clothing or hair is involved. The slowed-down high-speed footage makes these elements appear as if they're floating in water. That's precisely what was done in the end sequence of Del Toro's film. The actors were suspended on wires, and the soundstage once more was flooded with smoke. Even though the actress's hair was replaced later on, the fan helped with the coat's movement. To complete the illusion, several layers of volumetric lighting and bubbles were added in post. We can see how important fans and high-speed footage are in another dry for wet sequence, this time in Lord of the Rings: Fellowship of the Ring. When Sam sinks into the river Anduin, we see the dry for wet sequence in full effect. The slow motion and the wind flowing through Sam's clothes and hair make the effect believable. In the second movie, Two Towers, we see another dry for wet sequence. This time, it's Frodo falling into the dead marshes. In both cases, the extra elements like bubbles added in post make the sequence even more convincing. 2018's Aquaman also used dry for wet quite extensively. The majority of the movie happens underwater, and since it's an action movie, it involves a lot of complicated action sequences. Things that could only be done in a controlled dry environment. ILM devised multiple rigs for the actors depending on the type of action planned. These rigs gave the actors a floating, smooth movement look that would make the effect more convincing. One of the production's harder tasks, though, turned out to be the hair simulations to complete the effect. The hair not only had to look convincing, but the results had to be art-directable as well. And anyone who has run simulations before knows how much of a difficult task that is. The studio ended up producing more than 400 hair simulations across 670 effect shots. It's worth mentioning that the opposite of this technique, wet for dry, is also heavily used in movies. This gives off a supernatural look since the movement of the actors are not bound by gravity. The movie Fountain used that extensively in order to make Hugh Jackman feel like he's floating in space. Wet for dry is filmed in a water tank, usually with a blue screen behind the actor. The zero-gravity space scenes in Guardians of the Galaxy were also shot wet for dry, something James Gunn, the director of the movie, regretted. Wet for dry is quite difficult to shoot, and it requires a lot of post-work to hide the fact that it's filmed underwater. Even the simplest of elements, like bubbles, can turn into a nightmarish task. According to James Gunn, these underwater shots were one of the difficult sequences in the movie, and it required a lot of post-work to fix. Dry for wet is an incredible technique that can produce some really beautiful results. We've only covered a couple of movies, but there are plenty more using the effect. Most recently, the movie Underwater is using it extensively. The 2008 movie Spirit also has numerous dry for wet sequences, and if we go all the way back to 81, we can see some early dry for wet sequences in James Bond's For Your Eyes Only. As is the case with most visual effects, the key ingredients are very simple: smoke, volumetric lighting, fans, and wires. And with the addition of post-work enhancing the effect, the final shot can look very convincing. But in the end, all these techniques mean nothing if there's not a capable director and crew to drive the sequences. I'll have a list with some of the movies using this technique in the description below, so you can go back and watch them with a different eye. And with that, we've reached the end of this video. Hope you've learned something new and had some fun along the way. Take care, and I'll see you in the next one.